Today, I am joined by Yoram Hazony. He is an Israeli philosopher. He is a Bible scholar and political theorist. He's also the president of the Herzl Institute in Jerusalem, and he serves as the chairman of the Edmund Burke Foundation. He is also the author of a well known book, relatively in the past now, The Virtue of Nationalism, and a very new book called Conservatism, a Rediscovery. Welcome, Yoram.
It's great to see you, Alex,
Yeah, it's lovely
for
to have
having
you
me.
on. And I also want to thank you for inviting me to NatCon. That was a wonderful, just a wonderful event. I mean, I was surprised to be invited, but it was just great to meet you and to meet your family as well, because you travel with your family. It's something that's kind of unique, at least in our generation.
Well, you gave a spectacular speech. It was uh, immensely well received. I mean, the people who give me their opinions about such things thought you were spectacular, and you shouldn't be surprised. I don't know if you can travel to Miami with your growing family, but if it's possible, then we'd love to have you there too.
Lily, thank you so much. I mean, we'll see. My
Right.
my growing family is turning into quite the handful. At this point, he's about 10 months old, and he is just extremely agile, extremely sneaky and agile, and everywhere. So, yeah, we'll see if we can wrangle him. I also obviously want to talk about the new book, and it's called Conservatism: A Rediscovery. And conservatism means many things to many people. Conservatism has meant pretty much either of kind of fusionism or neoconservatism, or it's kind of the strains of in a way right liberalism that have marked the conservative movement in the last pretty much 50 years, in the U.S. and abroad. So I mean, I'm curious, what are the parameters of the worldview that you're proposing here? Does it have anything in common with these established ideas, or is it something completely revolutionary? Of how far back do you go to harness these ideas? So what are the main concepts here?
The things that you're naming, uh, neo neoconservatives, fusionists, libertarians. I don't know what else you just named. Um, these are right liberals. You said. Well, these are all versions of liberalism, and one of the things that I work hard to do in the book is to distinguish conservatism from liberalism, because you're you're right in hinting that it's all become very confused, especially in the last generation, but even a few decades before then. The traditional distinction between liberal and conservative uh, begins with liberalism being a political philosophy or a political movement that focuses on freedom. It's focused overwhelmingly on the freedom of the individual. And certainly the versions of liberalism that we've been dealing with in the last generation uh, are quite extreme in their strident insistence that if you give ever expanding liberties to individuals, then you'll solve most of society's problems. And conservatism is a very different creature. Uh, as I in my book, I begin by setting out a history of Anglo-American conservatism going back at least to the 1400s, and conservatism is a it's a competing political worldview that sees national and religious tradition as the key to strengthening and maintaining a nation through time. So even just from those few introductory words of definition, you can already see that uh, whereas liberals begin with the free and equal individual, some kind of imaginary state of nature in which human beings are perfectly equal and perfectly free and don't take on any obligations or responsibilities except the ones they consent to. Conservatives have never really bought any of that. So the conservative tradition here, I'm focusing specifically on the British and American one, but there are other conservative traditions as well. But what they all have in common is that they begin with individuals being born into families, and families being born into tribes, and tribes being born into nations. And all of these nations compete with one another, just like the tribes compete with one another, families compete with one another. Even within the family, human beings have a tendency to compete up until they are challenged from the outside, and then they come together and tend to come together and create a united front. So a conservative is somebody, I think, who begins with a much more realistic view of what human beings are, and from there pretty quickly gets to a much more realistic view of what human beings need.
Mm. Yeah, so it's essentially a competing value hierarchy where it's not autonomy and individualism at the top, but essentially kind of the relational dimension is above that. So I wonder what, because essentially at this point in kind of our political history, politics is almost synonymous with democracy. I mean, what position does democracy hold here? Because democracy essentially is downstream from this perspective of, okay, we have the individual consent, autonomy is the primacy, so they become the vehicle of kind of political voice. I wonder how that plays into your worldview.
Well, to begin with, conservatives are not necessarily Democrats. Um, the the uh, the tradition that I'm writing about in this book is one that developed out of monarchy, right? Out of British monarchy, and the English monarchy was for a very very long time somewhat different from French or German monarchs in that the traditional English Constitution had a place uh, for for people other than the king in decision making. So if we take In Praise of the Laws of England by John Fortescue, which was written around 1470, we see that his argument is that the people of England are better off because the Parliament, the bicameral legislature, is responsible for laws and is responsible for taxation, and the king can't simply do whatever he wants. And out of this structure of a tradition of power sharing between the king and his subjects, you get the gradual development of the American Constitution, which in its early version was very very similar to the English Constitution, and uh, none of the people involved in drafting any of these constitutions called them democracy at that time. But still, Fortescue claims that among the advantages of the English Constitution is that the people are freer than they are in other countries. When he says free, he's obviously not talking about what modern liberals mean when they say free, but he gives examples. He says, for example, the king cannot enter the house of an English farmer without his permission, and he certainly can't take things from the English farmer without his permission, or at least without a law from the legislature. So and Fortescue associates these kinds of rights with freedom. He says that the reason that the English people flourish financially, and the reason that they eat better than in other countries is because of the sanctity of property and because of a constitution that protects their property. So all of these things exist already in the 1400s in England, but I don't think anybody would have called it a democracy. So I think that if you ask, how does a conservative uh, in this tradition view democracy? I think that uh, the question is always, does it improve things or does it make things worse? And the democratization of the American Republic, I don't know. I don't think that the American Republic was doing badly before the two world wars. And if we're going to talk about where things go wrong, I'm not sure that things go wrong because of the fact that there's a extended suffrage in the United States. But we can talk about that.
Yeah, I think it's I think the issue that I see with democracy is that it brings in, essentially you could also say that it becomes ruled by media, because where does the informed citizen get their information to be so informed to actually make a decision on a political level. And then that there's competing interests there, and it also brings in it it turns politics into the matter of everyday life. Like there is a certain freedom from politics that you have in alternative systems that I think is quite underrated, in the sense that now it's become a complete obsession, and it's become synonymous to religion. Like the moment that religion left through the door, politics entered through the window, and now this is essentially the animating spirit for so much tribalism, for all of this. So I mean, I think that's people might argue with me that it's a price worth paying, but it might also not be.
Well, I understand what you're saying. I think it's very easy and appropriate to look at what there is now and say, what there is now is really terrible. The reason I say this is because what there is now really is terrible. Because I mean, we are watching the disintegration of American society and the American nation, and we're watching a very similar thing happen in the UK. And it's not at all clear that that having moved to all freedom all the time as the only value that's emphasized in these societies, it's not at all clear that they can survive. I mean, I just don't know that many people who have a great deal of confidence that the United States is going to exist 25 years from now. And now I'm a little bit older than you are, and probably than many of the listeners. So I can remember a time in which it didn't seem like the United States was on the verge of disintegrating. And so, my view of citizens voting and media striving to influence them is somewhat different, because when I was growing up in New Jersey, I was born in Israel, but I grew up in the United States. And when I was growing up, you know, certainly you knew that the major publications had a liberal slant. But you could basically count on their news to be reliable. In other words, you could in those days be someone who rejected the New York Times editorial line, but you could still trust that most of what it was that they were reporting was usefully accurate. And in the same way, it was impossible for the media, even if most of the media were liberal, it was impossible for them to just control the way that people think, because there were competing media. The current condition in which virtually all major media broadcast the same thoughts in lockstep with one another and in lockstep with a particular political line, and don't have any shame about using their platforms as a in order to advance a political agenda. This is a new thing. I mean, I certainly don't want to claim that that democracy always functioned perfectly well, but what we're seeing right now is a catastrophic shift from a culture in which reporters thought that whatever party they voted for, they thought that something like Hunter Biden's laptop would be a story that any one of them would want to break and want to be in the lead in, because corruption was simply something that anybody could get a Pulitzer for reporting on corruption. It didn't matter whether it was the right or the left. So again, without saying that it was utopian, I think that we have entered a period of utter dysfunction in the way that the media functions, and also other institutions. I mean, you can add the universities, which 30 years ago were able to tolerate a conservative or a rightist view on the faculty or among the students. And today, increasingly in most places, universities simply cannot tolerate these kinds of views. And we could go on, the government bureaucracy and so on. So we are certainly facing a horrific crisis, and we need to talk about what, if anything, can be done to get out of it. But I think that we should not exaggerate. I think it would be a mistake to exaggerate the kind of influence that the kind of political system you have has on whether it works or not. Because the reality is that I think that many different kinds of political system can be made to work well if the people are inheriting traditions of mutual loyalty and upholding the system and striving to make it work. And the moment that the people are inheriting disloyalty and contempt for one another and for the system itself, it doesn't matter how beautiful and perfect it is on paper, it will just stop working. And that's what we're seeing right now.
Yeah, and it feels to me like in liberalism itself, the kind of the baked in, essentially the self correcting feature of liberalism tends to become a god in itself. Like the idea that, okay, we are striving, essentially that's kind of the instinct in liberalism. We're always striving to morally improve, to end up on the right side of history, and that idea in itself kind of leads to that churning kind of resentment of the present moment, because we are, of course, still in the process of moral evolution. We kind of have to be a little bit, at least, resentful of our brethren, of the current situation, because we remember in the past we were, obviously the past is a very amoral place, or immoral place. The present, we're constantly improving, and only in the future will actual morality be possible. And even then, where you're still kind of in the churning permanent revolution. So I feel, if with kind of this current perspective, is it even possible to, I don't know, love your brethren, have any sort of ties to any sort of historical, or making any sort of peace with your own history?
Well, we just switched topics from democracy to liberalism, and
Yeah.
the democracy and liberalism obviously they're not the same thing. Democracy is an extended suffrage where many more people get to participate in electing at least certain parts, if not all parts of the government. Liberalism is not a system of government. Liberalism is a set of ideas, and it comes very close in its current form to being a kind of religion, because the assertion that everybody is that everyone is perfectly free and perfectly equal, and that they only need to take on obligations that they consent to. And you were just referring to a third plank in a lot of liberalism, which is the claim that all that human beings need to do is think and argue, and then we'll figure all the answers to everything out just by thinking. and we don't need any kind of inheritance or tradition to build on. This set of axioms it is a kind of a religion, and what it does is it undercuts and blots out any kind of good that's inherited from the past. And a very, very dramatic example of this is Thomas Jefferson, the one of the American founders um, who was quite excessive in his liberalism, and it was in many ways a model for what we're seeing today. And Jefferson said that repeatedly that every generation is related to the previous generation as if it were a foreign country. He thought that that every 20 years you should just start from scratch and make up all the laws that you think are good for you, and then 20 years later you'll just do it again. So when you refer to this permanent revolution, you really are talking about something that is baked in. It is baked into liberalism, and the reason that the United States and Britain were able to survive for 2 or 3 centuries without decaying is not because there were liberals, but because there were conservatives. There were large numbers of people whose focus was on maintaining inherited traditions. And that means that they thought a great deal. They thought a great deal about what you would need to do in order for your inherited traditions to be transmitted to future generations. And all of that comes to sort of a crashing end after the Second World War. We can argue about why it does, but it's only after the Second World War that God and Scripture become dispensable and are eliminated from the school system and from public life. And it turns out we did the experiment. It takes about 2 generations, between the time that you eliminate God and Scripture and the time that you can no longer tell the difference between a man and a woman. We've done the experiment, and I think that if we're talking about what it is that's the cause of the current troubles, I think that it's primarily liberalism that is the cause. I think it's liberalism that created the cult of that you were referring to, the cult of everybody figuring everything out for themselves without owing anything to the past, without owing anything to previous generations, and that's brought us to woke neo-Marxist revolution very, very quickly.
Yes, it does seem to, like a previous guest on the show has an idea that essentially the right wing was outlawed after the Second World War, and just wholesale, and the whole thought systems surrounding it, which include tradition and God, were also put to the side because they are part of this essentially memeplex of evil that needed to be scrapped, and it kind of ushered in an era that can essentially be called, not even liberalism, but like complete anti-fascism. And we just kind of have to dispose of anything that could be associated with that. And nowadays we can see that the word cloud of fascism includes all sorts of things from, I don't know, long dresses to any sort of, more classical cuisine, and anything that's not necessarily completely in flux and subject to woke powers is considered fascism. Do you think there's something to say something to that?
Well, yeah, there's quite a bit to it. I mean, I don't think that conservatism was outlawed, but I think that I have a chapter on what exactly happened in the 1950s and 1960s in my new book, and I think the best way to describe it is that the 2 world wars created a trauma both in America and Europe, and that trauma led to the adoption of a revolutionary program whose purpose was to, in a single generation, in a single swoop, like with one blow, to eliminate all evils that were perceived to have come from the past. So, I personally, as I read in the book, I think that Nazi Germany was sufficiently evil, and enough, American and British lives were lost. So I certainly am sympathetic to Americans who came home and said we don't want the ongoing persecution of blacks in the American South in our country. I think that makes sense. But the way that it was dealt with, looking back on it, seems to have been quite mistaken. The way that it was dealt with was to say, well, look, if we're not willing to persecute blacks because of the color of their skin, that means that we shouldn't make any distinctions between men and women, and we shouldn't make any distinctions between Christians and Jews and atheists, and that means we shouldn't make distinctions between our own citizens and foreigners, or foreigners coming from different places, and this just goes on and on as you go forward the decades. Then you're not allowed to make distinctions on the basis of age, and you're not allowed to make distinctions on the basis of physical disability, and you're not allowed to make distinctions according to sexual orientation. And God only knows what tomorrow is going to bring in this lunatic attempt to eliminate categories of any kind from the way that public life and private life are pursued in the countries that are adopting this. And that's at this point basically, all of the English-speaking countries and all of Europe as well, pretty much. So I think that it's correct to say that the well-intentioned attempt to solve some actual oppression turned into a lunatic attempt to a utopian attempt to eliminate any kinds of distinctions from society, and that has brought us to where we are. Let me say something about the word fascist, because liberals are not Marxists, and that doesn't, and all of us know some liberals who are willing to risk a great deal in order to fight the current Marxism. In my book, I argue that liberalism brings about Marxism. In other words, I don't think the two things are disconnected. I think that you can see and understand the mechanism by which liberals who say ignore tradition, ignore your inheritance, but exercise only your reason. Well, anybody who's educated in that way knows that as soon as everybody starts exercising their reason, then some of them will be liberals, and some of them will be conservatives, and some will be fascists, and some will be neo-Marxist revolutionaries, and it doesn't do what the liberals think it's going to do. What it does is the demand that everybody exercise their reason all the time does not bring some kind of positive order. It leads very quickly to the victory of these Marxist ideals. But with respect to fascism, it's also worth emphasizing that I've known more than a few people in my life whose views were fundamentally authoritarian. By authoritarian, I mean that they're also not interested in inherited traditions. They're interested in finding somebody who can establish who has enough power to establish any kind of order. And of course, if you are in a society that is in advanced stages of disintegration, and that begins as moral disintegration, but then it very quickly moves to actual violence and internal disorder of the kind that makes it impossible to do anything, to do any of the basic things human beings normally want to do. Under those conditions, historically, people tend to turn to whoever it is who can muster a large enough army to to shut it all down, to shut down the violence and establish some kind of peace. And this is an old story. I mean, we see it in ancient history and we see it in modern history. But there's there's a difference between somebody who says, look, we've reached the stage of hopelessness, and there's nothing we can do other than to erect a dictator, right? So let's call that an authoritarian, and that could be, under the right conditions, that could be almost anybody if things have gotten bad enough. Conservatives are not authoritarians. Conservatives make a different claim, which is that the things that are the last 3,000 years of biblical tradition have given us, or the last 1,000 years of Anglo-American constitutionalism, that those things do have worthy things in them that many of us would like to have if we could get them. And so the difference between a conservative and an authoritarian today, at this moment, I guess, would be that a conservative says to the authoritarian, look, I understand why you think things are terrible. I agree with you that things are terrible. And I agree with you that if things keep going in this direction for a few more years, then all is going to be lost. And then there's not going to be any choice anymore other than some kind of civil war or a foreign invasion. But a conservative says to an authoritarian, are you sure that you want to take the next 5, 10, 30 years of your life and sit on the sidelines and wait for things to get as bad as you think they're going to get, just carping at the people who are actually trying to do something to save things? How about if you lend me those next 5 or 15 years of your life and join us, and let's try to save something out of this?
Okay, so from the situation that we're in now to the worldview that you expose in the book, what would the pathway be? Would it be to essentially convince people on a democratic level, okay, this is a worthwhile cause, activism, just essentially kind of a populist revolution in the conservative direction? Or is there, you could see how some people might think that there are shortcuts to this, but
Yeah.
yeah, so I wonder how, because essentially that's pretty much the point of tension there. How to get these good things that we
Yeah.
all agree are good.
Okay. So I try to deal with this at 2 different levels in the book. One of them is the political level, where I think that it's pretty obvious. There are many places in America and Europe where there's no point whatsoever in discussing conservative ideas. There's no chance of them being peacefully chosen through the democratic process. And my suggestion is that that people who want a more conservative life should not stay in those places, that they should pick up and move to some place where there's a plausible likelihood of of establishing either a Christian majority. So I think you need to look and ask yourself, all right, I live in Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, there's not going to be a Christian or a pro-Christian or a pro-biblical majority in my lifetime. It is absurd to think so. And so you should pick up and move to Florida or to Alabama or to some other state or to some other country, as you yourself did, Alex, where the likelihood of being able to maintain and establish a majority that is going to favor traditionalism as a political way of life and as a private way of life is still plausible. And the problem, one of the problems that we have is that, for example, in the United States, this goes to the question of, were conservatives outlawed? So in certain respects, you can say they were, because when the Supreme Court in the United States decided in 1947 that separation of church and state would be imposed on all of the states from above, from the center, without any kind of popular vote, which certainly no popular vote would have actually enacted this. And so from that time, there has been an actual legal obstacle to people saying, look, we tried liberalism as a public philosophy. That doesn't work. It collapsed. We now see the Marxism that's coming, and we don't want that. So what we'd like to do is we'd like to retrace our steps a few years, and we'd like to establish some kind of Christian public philosophy, which will be the framework for life in our state. I think that is highly plausible in many places in America and Europe still at this time. And I think that's what people should fight for, because because we're all told that that if Florida were run according to a Christian moral vision, and kids were taught Bible in school, we're all told that it would be like Iran of the Ayatollahs. And I don't know anyone who wants to live in Iran of the Ayatollahs, regardless of what their worldview is. And the question is that true? See, I find it extremely doubtful. I know a great many Christians, and I find it extremely doubtful that that the kind of Christian regimes that would be established in various states in the United States would be anything like the Iran of the Ayatollahs. So once you have a place like that, once you have a number of different experiments, and some of them will be better and some of them will be worse, they'll all be different from one another. But once you can see them and compare to what's happening in California and in New York, I think a lot of people will begin to feel more sympathetic than they are right now. Okay, so all of that is at the political level. I think there is a trajectory that allows some kind of possibility of saving things. But at the private level, I should say that this is, to me, at least as important is what people are doing with their private lives. Because I've just described something that, okay, you could vote for it, you could, campaign for it, you could do all sorts of things, but it's not a life. It's not a conservative life. It's a program to try to have some kind of conservative democracy instead of liberal democracy. But let's talk about people's lives. People's lives are not in a good place. Of course, there's some people who are in a good place, but if we're talking about, the average young person who I know who's right of center, they're not living the kind of life that, I don't think they're living the kind of life that I would want for my children, but I think that they're unhappy with their lives. They don't talk like people who, I think everything's going great for me. It's just too bad that, that the country's going, the wrong direction, but I'm fine. Okay. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a generation, a very large part of the current generation, which consciously, these are people who consciously blame their parents and their grandparents for the wrong turn that has been taken. And I'm agreeing that there was a wrong turn. And instead of picking themselves up and plugging back into the chain of transmission so that they can learn what they didn't learn about how to lead a conservative life, how to lead a life of conservation and transmission, so that things that are good and great and beautiful and true can come into their lives and be passed on to future generations through them. Instead of doing that, they sit around reading all of this rightist revolutionary stuff, which fantasizes about how great it'll be if we have some kind of techno-atheist dictator or Catholic emperor, or there's 100 different fantasies, but it's all science fiction. None of it changes the lives of the people who are reading this stuff. And I say the first step is change your life, plug back into the chain of transmission, get married, start having kids, start building your fantasy kingdom with your own hands in your own life, and you'll feel better, and then you'll pave the way for others to be able to do it too.
Yes, I mean, I have to agree. I mean, that's essentially what we've been trying to do in practical terms. It is a bit hard because the level of disconnection to the chain of being was very intense. I mean, I don't even remember exactly what generation it was where we were connected, because we had essentially communism, and communism was this whole upheaval here. It just deracinated everyone. I mean, my family comes from Hungary, from Poland, from Czech Republic, from Germany, like a enclave. So everyone's kind of, just. I would have to. I don't think there's actually even. Written down versions of anything in my family history. Everything that I would piece back together would have to be based on, I don't know, historical accounts written by people who've never met my family, and just kind of reimagining again what
Okay,
it
but
must have been like.
yeah, fair enough. Many people are in that condition. But if I could make a suggestion, I think that in the last couple of chapters of my book are focus especially on this issue of leading a conservative life. But there's other sections about the traditional family and the congregation. I think there's a lot of things people don't necessarily understand about how these things work. The human beings, obviously the first and most important tradition that you inherit is from your parents. And if you're in a traditional family, then it's not just from your parents; it's from your. There are other parts of the family that are in close by, and if you don't get along with your parents, you can inherit all sorts of things from your grandparents. And if you don't get along with your grandparents, a lot of people adopt the customs of their aunts and uncles. Which, by the way, if you read, I tell a little bit about my story in the book. And because of the fact that a great deal was missing in the home that I grew up in, I ended up spending a lot of time with my aunt and uncle who were Orthodox Jews, and they're not just kind of an adoptive alternate family. They're part of a congregation, which is to say, there are all these neighbors, and the neighbors also, each one is running their own slightly different version of the traditions. And real living traditions are not things that you read in a book. They're not things you read in an entire library of books. The books can be helpful, but real learning takes place only from human beings. And so the young person who wants to heal himself or herself and to live a life that is healthier and more fruitful, the number one thing that they need to do is to find an appropriate congregation. It may be that the members of your family don't have much of a tradition, so you need to find a congregation. These days, living traditions are mostly still exist in Orthodox Christian or Jewish congregations. I mean, maybe there are other corners, but that's in most places that's the direct path. Is that you need to find an Orthodox congregation where the traditions are still being handed down, not simply as something that's spoken, but people live according to them. Because there's a great deal about living as a conservative person that you can't understand in the first years that you're looking at it. You see what's happening, but you don't understand the causes that are actually operative. And so what you need is not to be reading. I mean, reading's helpful, but the thing you really need is to find those families, that congregation, those older people who still are capable of being a model, so that you can start learning again. And this can happen at any age. You don't have to be 12 in order to start learning, but if you're willing to give them honor and you're willing to respect their way of life and say, look, I'm ignorant, I'm coming here to learn, this is something you can do at any age, but you need people, models, actual people who are living the life you want to live, so that you can then start to build up your abilities in this area.
Yes, I think a lot of people who come to traditionalism, or they're essentially coming like myself from a need. They feel, okay, there is a void at the center of my existence. We need to fill this. This feels like the thing that we should be inserting, and we obviously start reading, and you kind of rationalistically push yourself into this direction, especially if there are no people. I mean, my family is very small, not conservative at all. So I've kind of, I'm probably by far the most conservative person in a 10-mile radius, even here in Romania where I live. But it's yeah, it's one of those things where um, it's these things exist. But I think in my case, being Catholic, in a very minoritarian region of Romania where everyone else is Orthodox Christian. I know that's something that people do convert to, and it's actually something that it's I won't say trending, but it's definitely something that more people are doing now, especially in the U.S. It feels a bit strange to hear that people want to be Romanian Orthodox in, I don't know, in the U.S. or something like that, and it makes it more interesting to me. To me, it's been, I've been a bit distant to it because I'm very familiar with it. It all seems, I don't know, very ritualistic, and it just kind of has that feeling of backwardness to me. But at the same time, it's definitely something that I'm looking into more, reading more about. I should probably just go to a church and talk to someone.
I I think doing it teaches things that reading about it doesn't teach. I'm not saying, look, my tradition, the Jewish tradition, is extraordinarily book oriented, and there's constant public readings of the Torah, and people are constantly studying, and it's very, very bookish tradition. So I don't in any way mean to downplay it, but ultimately the kind of knowledge that you gain that allows you to understand what these books are talking about comes from experience. It comes from doing. It comes from all of these. It, handing down traditions and receiving them is a skill. It's not. It's not an item of knowledge. It is a skill, like riding a bicycle, and um, just like you can't read a cookbook and know how to make a cake. You need to have experience making the cake over and over and over again, trying and trying. Sometimes you succeed, sometimes you fail. Eventually you figure out how to make it, do it right. And the same thing is true for every aspect of the tradition. Raising children is trial and error. You can't get it out of a book. Every child is different. Every adult is different. The situation is different. You need trial and error, and the same thing is true. Anything having to do with participating in public prayer, or anything having to do with God. These are these are things that your view of them changes with the experience. And now I'm not saying that every person will fit into the first church that they decide to go to. They might not, but if you can have this much faith, okay, I'm going to talk about a very, very small amount of faith. I think if you can muster enough faith to say, look, all those people, those last 2,000 years of Christianity or 3,000 years of Judaism, they couldn't all have been just stupid people like the liberals say they are. Like, I don't believe the liberals in almost anything they say. Why should I believe them when they tell me that all my ancestors were ignorant fools? If you can have enough faith in your own great great grandparents and their great great grandparents to say, I'm going to trust you far enough. Let me try this. Let me try living the way that they lived, and see what happens. I think that most people who I've seen in my life who've gotten that far and they've said, I'm going to try this. I want to see what happens to me. I think the great majority very quickly become surprised by what they learn about what keeping the Sabbath does for you, about what being part of a congregation does for you. It changes your lives in all sorts of ways that you just can't imagine.
Yes, I think people shouldn't underestimate how powerful even kind of this via negativa approach to religion and tradition is. Just being kind of scared straight by liberalism. I think there are quite a few people who just see, this. They just say this can't be right. This literally can't be right. Let's see what the other traditions have to offer. Um, so I also wanted to ask you about the role of technology in all of this, because like you said, in maybe 30, 40 years ago, we had democracy, we had mass media. It wasn't like this. The quality and quantity of media, the speed at which it's delivered, the directness at which one can access all of this stuff has accelerated, you know, exponentially at this point. I mean, and also the kind of the disintermediation between the individual and the market, and all sorts of new sources of dopamine, sources of comfort that happen between just the individual and whatever provider of either sustenance or internet or, I don't know, pornography, all sorts of things that come to you directly. You don't really need even to. There's no middleman here. It's just you and whoever provider wants to send you these things. um, I think that's probably tied to disembodiment as well. Like you mentioned before, you have to do things and you have to live them and you have to actually participate in doing things in real life. And it's also I mean, this could probably turn into a drinking game. The many times I say the revealed preference here on the show, but it is a revealed preference. I mean, for example, you have this wonderful article about the nuclear family and the fact that it's an insufficient standard. But for a lot of people, it is a revealed preference. Living alone, it's a luxury. It's something that a lot of people can afford nowadays, and it's a revealed preference. I think we could move in with our parents, but I think most people would just say no, and the parents would say no as well.
Well, I, I don't know if you need to move in with your parents. I mean, Yael and I, as you know from the book, we have 9 children, and the, they're all very very different from one another, and some of them are are by nature, they're kind of loyalists, and they want to be as close to their parents as possible and to be as much like their parents as possible. And others are kind of rebels by nature, and they're from a very 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 young age they're looking for their space and the way that they can find their place in the world, without following the track that their parents went. But and at different stages, different parts of their lives, different kids have moved back into the house. I mean, look, we have a pretty big house, and it's part of this discussion is if you want to live in a more conservative way, then you need to that means you're going to have more. If you're going to have more children, then you need more space. If you're going to have your grandparents living anywhere near you, you need space. So I'm not advocating everybody living in the same house. I don't think that that's necessary. I think some people want to live close and some people want to live further away. But further away can be the other side of town. It doesn't have to be, you move 2,000. You turn 18. You go to college. You move 2,000 miles away from your family, and you never come back. I mean, that's like a ridiculous extreme, where I think that each person will have their own most comfortable distance from their family members. And I want to emphasize again that sometimes it's not parents, sometimes it's your aunt and uncle. But the point that I think is crucial here is that healthy human beings do not live alone. And I spend a lot of time alone. I mean, I'm a writer. I spend a tremendous amount of time, in a room alone, reading books and writing things. And nevertheless, a healthy human being is somebody who is not just socializing with others. Okay, that's true, but I don't think that's enough. I think healthy human beings have to always have people that they look up to, living people who are uh, teachers for them. And I think it's a mistake to think that that ends when you're 18 years old. I think that all healthy people throughout their lives continue to learn from people who are older than they are. And uh, but in order for you to know whether that's true or not, you would actually have to be near some people who are older than you are, who you could be talking to about things. And since most people never even saw their parents do it, so at this point, it's I think more than a revealed preference, it is a kind of a tradition. There is an evil, crummy tradition of cutting yourself off from anything, from any inheritance at an early age, and then trying to do it by yourself. And by the way, it's not just kids leaving their parents; it's also kids feeling they have no obligation to their parents. At a certain point, your parents start getting older, and when they start, I mean, getting really older, and then the tables kind of turn, and you need to start taking care of them. So liberal societies come up with this incredibly barbaric institution of the old age home, or the retirement community, where you send away your parents so that you don't, so somebody else takes care of them theoretically, so that you don't have the burden of doing it. And this is like the flip side of leaving your parents and cutting yourself off from the tradition, is that towards the ends of their lives, you know, most people, it doesn't even occur to them that a traditional degree of gratitude that you would owe your parents would mean that you would owe them to take care of them yourself, so that they can see. I mean, when they're approaching the end of their lives, what do they want to see? They want to see you living uh, a life that they can be proud of. They want to see grandchildren so living a life that they can be proud of. The older they get, the more they live through you. And so you're sending them away to an old age home to play, whatever it is, mahjong, or checkers, or whatever it is, with other old people. But what you've really done is you've said that the people who gave me life, and the people who taught me everything for years and sacrificed everything that they had to in order to make my life all right. And that's, even if you don't like your parents, that's true for most parents of children. And those people did not do enough so that you would live close enough to them to give them this feeling that they didn't fail, that they succeeded, that something is flourishing and coming out of what they did. It's just this horrendous devil's bargain where you choose to live alone now because you feel like it, but are you going to feel like it when you're 70? And the answer is no. You're not going to feel like it. You're going to be wretched. And whoa, I mean, what, you can't see that coming?
Exactly. I feel like there's this kind of age blindness that kind of, I mean, I'll call it liberalism, but whatever we're living under this hypnosis, it seems that on the one hand they also want us segregated by age. Like there's very little mingling between the ages, even
Right.
in schoolrooms. Okay, you have your 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds. They barely touch, they barely socialize, and then I think there's also kind of a ranking by degree of autonomy, because everyone thinks that they're going to be 25 years old continuously under liberalism. Like even the mirage that the 20-something young woman living in the city, getting a career, it rarely occurs to them that they'll be turning 30, or it's like just a thought in the back of their mind that, okay, something might change, but don't worry, everyone's patting them on the back. Don't worry, it's still the same. You still can pursue your career. Maybe McKinsey will freeze your eggs, or who knows, someone will come in and swoop and save you from death and decay. And then the idea that these women might even be considering what's going to happen at 70 or 80 or is beyond the pale. No one really actually thinks about these things. So it's it's a strange blindness, this is a strange, we're almost frozen in amber in our mid-20s, because that's the point of highest autonomy, and it's also kind of the point of highest permanent revolution, where we're on the cusp of something, but you'll not always be on the cusp of something.
Yeah, I think you make a really important point there when you talk about the sorting people by age, so that most of the waking hours and most of the social scene is with people who are your own age, and that happens, you know, to little children as soon as they go to kindergarten, and it's still happening to old people who are being sorted by, okay, now you go to a retirement home. And just think for a moment about what human communities were like, 100 years ago, or certainly 200 years ago, but probably still most places 100 years ago. It before everybody started going to public school. Okay, let's just imagine this. You live in a community where the number one center of activity is your parents' business, which, because the home is also a business, and people of different ages are participating in this business. Chances, I mean, it depends what it was, but chances are your mother and your father worked together in order to run the business, whatever it was, the farm or the workshop or whatever it was. And the children spend a lot of time with adults, and they spend a lot of time, there may have been young hired hands who are a different age, so they spend a lot of time with children who are older, and they get to see people getting married and children being born and raised from a tiny age, and they also get to see aging, because you don't send your parents away to someplace 200 miles away to die. They get to see aging. They get to see the respect that's paid to aging parents. They get to learn what death is, not just that your gerbil or your goldfish died, but they get to see what human death is like. And those people who grow up like that, they just have a much clearer view of what a human being is at every stage of its life. It's not vague. It's concrete, like you see it happening right in front of your eyes. I mean, you're describing I definitely do think it's related to liberalism, because it all in the end comes down to this crazy assertion that we're by nature perfectly free and perfectly equal, when in fact by nature we're not perfectly free and we're not perfectly equal. Like, both of these things are just not true. And I just think these are all crazy deductions from that.
Yeah, it feels to me like that's the main illusion for a lot of young people, that this is gonna last forever. But sometimes, yeah, it becomes clear that, yeah, it's maybe 20 years. That's about as much autonomy, or that's about as much as the illusion of the liberal individual might last for some. For most, it doesn't last even that much. Um, I want to ask you the question of the show, because I know we're coming up on time a little bit. Um, do you have a thinker who was influential in your work, maybe, that you think is underrated? Could be a subversive thinker in the spirit of the show, that you think people should look into, read more of, or yeah, just be more interested in.
Okay, well, how about the prophet Jeremiah? Um, I, 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 I think in general, uh, Old Testament heroes are pretty subversive. I mean, there's kind of people who don't know a lot about the Bible assume that it's all a bunch of people obeying commands, and it's actually, I mean, Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament is almost the opposite. All of the great figures that you can come up with from the beginning to the end are their actions are marked by standing out from the crowd and being disobedient or subversive in various ways. So just to give you some a quick glimpse into this, in the book of Exodus, the Jews they're enslaved in Egypt, and they're there for centuries, and they're being killed and they're being brutalized, and all these terrible things are happening. They're crying to God, but nothing happens. Nothing happens until these Pharaoh, the Egyptian king, decides he wants to kill the children, to kill all the male children. So he tells the midwives who are working for him. He says, just whenever the Hebrew children are, if a male is born, kill them at birth. And they refuse. They refuse they tell him they're going to do it, but they refuse to do it. They disobey. And because the midwives disobey, one of the male children who escapes being killed is Moses. And his mother hides him for 3 months. She also disobeys. And his sister Miriam takes care of him. She also disobeys. And then when he gets to be too old and they can't hide him anymore, they put him on the Nile and set him adrift. And and this little 3-month-old baby in a basket ends up in the hands of Pharaoh's daughter, who's bathing in the Nile. And Pharaoh's daughter disobeys too. Pharaoh's daughter disobeys the order of her own father to rescue this Hebrew child, and he's raised in the palace. And the rabbinic tradition says, if it weren't for now we've counted 2 midwives, Moses' mother, his sister, and now Pharaoh's daughter. It's a conspiracy of 5 women who are responsible, each one through subversion and disobedience, for creating the savior that in the end is going to lead the Jews out of Egypt. And the rabbis say this explicitly in the rabbinic tradition. They say, if it weren't for the disobedience of the women of Egypt, we would all still be in Egypt. Okay, so I think I should probably just say read the Bible more. But I was going to say just something about the prophet Jeremiah, that he is an astonishingly eloquent, independent thinker who throws himself, at great danger against the elites, the political elites, the religious elites, the whole ruling structure of the Jews in Jerusalem, and argues that they're headed for destruction. It should remind you of what we're seeing now. He says you're headed for destruction, and he suffers immensely for saying it, but he keeps saying it. And wow, what a story it is. At the end, he sees something none of us have ever seen. He sees the actual destruction of his kingdom, of his country, and the exile of his people. Read that story. It will tell you a lot about who and what you can be if you're not afraid, and if you're willing to target your subversion and your activism towards things that are great and good, instead of just cynical dissent, which leads nowhere.
Yes, and surprisingly, I think this is the first time the Bible was recommended on this podcast. Even though I've had quite a few religious people and a few traditionalists on, the people try to dig deep, but I think this is a classic for a reason. Thank you so much, Yoram. This was lovely speaking to you. I want to point people towards the book again, Conservatism, a Rediscovery. It is, and it's available widely now, isn't it?
You can get it everywhere.
Okay. Perfect.
for the time being, until they pull it.
Oh yes, I mean, hopefully times have changed. I hear lots about the vibe shift, so hopefully this is a part of it, and people leave you alone. Thank you again. This was lovely to speak with you.
Likewise. God bless you and your family.
Thank you.